One of the best models in the country is the Research Triangle. And I went to a game in the 1960s, and they got rained out, and they were in the clubhouse lamenting the fact that they spent all this money sending their sons and daughters to school, and then they don't come back to Durham or Raleigh or Chapel Hill because there was really not a lot to do there. They wanted the city lights of Charlotte or Atlanta or New York because there was just tobacco and lumber and furniture making in that area of the country. Those 6 guys went out and bought 4,600 acres of land. And they called it the Research Triangle. And half the people thought they were nuts. But they convinced the state to work with them on infrastructure, and they worked with the universities to understand better the kind of cutting-edge research they were doing. You might know today, 40 years later, that the Research Triangle has the highest per capita education rates of any place in the country. It has 40,000 people working there in one of the highest per capita income areas of the country also, because those 6 guys saw the future. They saw the opportunity that the universities represented for them. Pittsburgh faced the same challenge. You know, I was mayor of Pittsburgh for 12 years. It was a city known as hell with the lid off. How many of you ever been to Pittsburgh? So a lot of you have. Now, if you're young, you don't remember that hell with the lid off. But when I was growing up there, we always said we didn't know the sky was blue, we didn't know there were stars at night. It was just always gray. And when we were going out to play, our mothers would always say to us 2 things: be home before the streetlights come on, and my mother would always say, don't ever go near those rivers. If you go in those rivers, you're gonna melt, is what she'd say, because they were so polluted. Well, that all changed. And Pittsburgh went from being one of the most polluted and environmentally degraded places in the country to one of the greenest places now. And it has been large part shaped by, in more ways than many places in the country, by the recognition that the universities and the underlying research going on in the universities, hospitals, was our competitive advantage. It was our new coal mines. And if you think of a coal mine, the coal in the ground doesn't create value. What happens is you've got to build infrastructure to get that value out of the ground. You've got to build the rail and the coal mines and to move it to market. And so in many ways your universities and hospitals are the same way as that coal. That underlying research is there, and the challenge is, what you're working hard to do, is to understand how you move it to market, how you commercialize it, how the technology transfer policies of those universities play an important role, the availability of early stage and venture capital in the region, of how you create an entrepreneurial culture where you have lawyers and accountants that understand how to work with a bright young person who has an idea or maybe is tinkering in their garage. That all becomes important in helping to shape this, and particularly the capital. Venture capital is very important, and the United States leads the rest of the world in this risk capital, the willingness of pension funds and private individuals to invest in startup companies. The bad news for all of us is that 2/3 of the venture capital invested in the United States is invested in 3 places. And you're not one of them. Nor is Pittsburgh. It's invested in, guess where? Silicon Valley, Boston, and the New York region. And if you saw The Social Network, anybody see The Social Network? If you saw The Social Network, you know Zuckerman moved his company from Boston to California in large part because venture capital was even more available there. That venture capital is about a business climate, in part. It's about a business climate that rewards risk-taking. It rewards people to think about how do you start companies. And so that Southeast, you have $900 million invested in 6% of the total venture capital invested in the United States, but you're sharing that with Charlotte and Atlanta and a host of other places. And these 3 slides, while confusing, are the top 20 areas of the country in investments in venture capital. So you can see in 2007, in the San Jose area, $7.5 billion in venture capital was invested. The last column on your right-hand side is a list of the amount of research dollars on average going into those areas. And so you can see in San Francisco, there's almost $2.5 billion of venture capital invested in 2007, and they get, the universities and hospitals there, almost $2.3 billion on average annually in research. This is the second tier, and they're not surprises there. And the third tier is all of these, and I'm proud to point out Pittsburgh at the bottom there. Though we had the most growth because we focused very hard in getting venture capital firms. In Pittsburgh, we required our pension funds in the state to invest up to 2% of their assets into venture capital firms on a match, meaning you bring $2 of private money for every $1 of public money. It brought 17 venture capital firms to headquarter in Pittsburgh. You know what it's like when money is available? It makes a whole different conversation, and it changed our economy. And so you can see in Pittsburgh we had the largest growth, 533% in increases in venture capital over a 10-year period, more than any other place, in part because we started so low, in part because venture capital became available in city. This is your capital availability. You know, in both areas, it's not bad. But it's an area that if you're going to take advantage of your raw materials, you're gonna have to do better on it. You're going to have to think about how do we get venture capital to want to begin to look more at this area. And these are the areas a survey of venture capitalists just done last year where they see the next investments happening. One is in clean technologies, the other is in healthcare, medical services, and that's part of your strengths. You have opportunities there, and you ought to understand better how to take advantage of that. So let's maybe quickly wrap up. It's always about leadership, and you're here having that conversation. It's always about those 6 guys in the Research Triangle who stood up and said, we can be something different. It's about Horatio Nelson Jackson, who saw the future and said, this is going to have a huge impact on our society. It's you now making this decision. One of the lessons I've learned is that every time you want to do something different, there's 100 people giving you a reason not to do it. And they either get to define the agenda or you get to define it by saying we're going to reach beyond where we think we can go. The other is you need to know where you're going. And that's part of what your conversation is about today. The third is you need to have the institutional capacity. Most of us in most regions have 20th century or 19th century government and business structures. They might not work anymore. And so what's the institutional capacity that gets you to the 21st century? How do you make these deals happen? How do you shape the availability of venture capital? How do you shape the relationships with the universities and hospitals to take more advantage of those technologies? Are those institutions in place? Are they empowered? That's a huge issue. The other, which we talked about, is financing. It's the infrastructure. What I'd like to have you make sure you leave with is the infrastructure is about roads and sewer and water, and how you build your environment will determine how much money you spend on that. But it is also about other stuff. It's about a 21st century city having the infrastructure that encourages entrepreneurship and risk-taking. It's about education. It's about states all across the country making choices to whack public education budgets at the very time when it becomes the most important thing, I believe, for a region to be competitive in the kind of economy that's shaping itself all over the country. It is finally about what you want to look like as a community. You know, I find when I travel there's a disease in the water, and it's called the it'll do disease.